Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. So the U.S. is confirming the beginning of discussions to withdraw its soldiers from Niger. Those are kind of weasel words there. Beginning of discussions, that leaves a lot of room for the U.S. to try to change their minds later on, drag their feet, hem and haw, which is what they've been doing. They don't want to leave. Now, the situation in Niger was already the subject of a morning briefing last month, but I think it does bear a follow-up. The U.S. has already made a number of abortive attempts to try to forestall the inevitable, so-called revisions to the current agreement with Niger, which basically means the U.S. wanted to make a few minor changes, a couple of insignificant details, which in reality would have changed nothing. But clearly the Nigerian government isn't fooled. They're still telling the U.S. to take a hike regardless. Now, the loss to access of the quote-unquote air base that the U.S. has in Niger, which is nothing more than a platform for drone attacks, this is now understood to be a major setback for the U.S. and its allies in the region because of its strategic location for security operations in the Sahel. This is what the Aryan propagandist, the Associated Press, is saying. So even this major white media mouthpiece has to admit that this is a major setback for global white empire that the U.S. is suffering. White supremacy doesn't like taking L's. They don't take it very well at all. But their consolation prize in the white media is a claim that, the U.S. is also going to withdraw the foreign aid that it's been sending. Apparently, they don't think that the Nigerian government has already taken that into account. Obviously, whatever the U.S. was giving them wasn't nearly enough. The U.S.'s so-called aid hasn't made a scintilla of difference for the lives of anyone in Niger. The AP says the U.S. has also invested hundreds of millions of dollars in training Niger's military since it began operations there in 2013. First of all, practically none of that money has made it to the pockets or the bellies of the Nigerian people, and the Nigerian military is hardly in first world shape. Those hundreds of millions of dollars hasn't meant anything. That $100 million air base that they claim to have built, that is nothing more than a drone platform, and by the way, it's cheap. $100 million, that is literally a drop in a bucket for the U.S. government. It means nothing for the U.S. military. The Nigerian people have gotten nothing out of it, and when the U.S. military claims that it spends millions and millions of dollars on something, keep in mind, that means that some defense contractor has grossly overbilled the U.S. government to pay for something. That's what it means. $200 for a hammer, $50,000 for a Jeep. After a little while, you're talking about some real money. Let's understand that accounting figures become hugely exaggerated when you're talking about the U.S. government in general, and even worse when you're talking about the U.S. military. They're actually talking about the white government in the U.S. giving hundreds of millions of dollars to white military arms corporations, these big suppliers and contractors. It's money moving from one white hand to another. That is not hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to the Nigerian people. It's just the same old dirty business of white supremacy. How much has it helped the average Nigerian person on the street when the U.S. brings in drones? Does that contribute to the Nigerian standard of living? When the U.S. uses that drone base as a launch pad for bombing raids throughout Africa and portions of the Middle East, truth be told, does that put even one crumb on a Nigerian citizen's plate? Does it put one penny in their pockets? So where's this alleged benefit that the Aryan propagandist, the AP, wants us to think that the Nigerian people are getting? Where's the benefit at? They certainly don't get security out of it because they become a target for every group in the region and the world who doesn't like the United States. This is a lesson that should have been taken away from the bombing of the Kobar Towers in Kenya by Al-Qaeda. When you decide that you're going to be hosting the United States, other countries and other groups out there look and say, obviously you're mobbed up with white supremacy, so you become a target too. That's what actually happens. When you've been militarily colonized, that's not security. And then you have arrogant white officials from the U.S. who went to Niger and began acting like arrogant white officials from the U.S., talking disrespectfully to the Nigerian people, showing no deference for people when you're a foreigner in their country. They're in somebody else's land, talking to the native people there as if they're the foreigners. Yeah, this is white supremacist arrogance on full display. That's what led to this rift in the first place. And this has been the result. If you can't rein in your mouth, you force somebody else to do it for you. And now the U.S. is watching as the Nigerians are making closer ties with Vladimir Putin. Yeah, you could see that one coming. You thought it stopped with the Wagner Group, didn't you? It hasn't. The Russians have long-term plans for how they're going to get their hooks into Africa and get their hands on Africa's resources. Obviously, Putin is not there out of the goodness of his heart. He's there because he wants land for his own military operations, and he sees that Africa is treasure house for the world. As far as he's concerned, he's there to get his piece. See, this is what the whole pathetic farce of AFRICOM has led to. You had a phony baloney organization where they put one lonely little token Negro out front and claim that he's the one running it, when it's obvious to everyone he's not running anything. General What's-His-Name, he was nothing more than a sock puppet, with white power's hand right up his rear end, and the Africans weren't fooled. Well, not enough of them were fooled, clearly. You might have fooled a few of them, but obviously you didn't fool enough of them. And you see that this was nothing more than a thinly veiled bribery scheme, the U.S.'s involvement there. The APP says, quote, the rupture of relations between the two nations would impact the development and humanitarian aid funds destined for Niger, a country at the bottom of many indicators of well-being. This is what the U.S. does with its soft power. It uses a check that it holds over the heads of these countries and tells them you have to play ball if you want to keep this free cash coming in. But part of the deal is you also have to accept the U.S.'s verbal abuse, too. When they show up and wag their bony little fingers in your face and lecture you, you're expected to keep your head down and just take it. White supremacy is an abusive relationship, but it seems that at least some of the Nigerians finally got tired of it. But this nonsense about Niger is at the bottom of many indicators of well-being, who the hell is that supposed to be for? That's supposed to be for the mostly white readership in the AP. This is your consolation prize. When you see those poor little Africans, they're going to be sorry. They're going to be sorry. They're already sorry now. Sorry that they let the U.S. in. And you can tell that this is seen and understood as the huge blow that it is to the ego of white supremacists. The clowns over at Fox News, just copied and pasted the AP's report. The only thing they bothered to change was just the headline. But the gist of their little article, such as it was exactly the same. Oh, those Africans, they're just a bunch of poor little savages in the dirt, and they'll be sorry without the white man here. The same inbred morons who are constantly complaining about how it makes no sense for the U.S. to maintain a global military presence, all these bases dotted all over the world, now suddenly they're the biggest supporters of a global military footprint. Because the white supremacist egos got bruised by this one. That's the real problem here. Seeing black men telling white people what to do and then seeing them humbled and having to do it. That's the problem. That's what angers them. The goal by the U.S. is now seen and understood that if maybe they can keep the door in Niger open, if they can just stall long enough that hopefully tempers will cool, the Nigerians they hope will lose their resolve, if they can just jawbone them to death or just talk them to death, stall for time, then maybe the Nigerians will finally relent on some things and the U.S. can save some face and they can perhaps resume operations at this base at some time in the near future. That's the goal now. And I warned you about this last month, that the chances of the Nigerians backtracking on this, it's fair to middling that they actually would. The AP piece quotes who they call a local activist, someone who may or may not be a bootlick in the pocket of these white NGOs. This so-called activist says that American troops could potentially return after negotiations, and that the ruling Niger junta, the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, wants to maintain a good working relationship with the U.S. This is what's already being said, but keep in mind this is coming from the Aryan propagandist, and a lot of this stuff they put out there in the hopes that people will see it and think that there's something legitimate about it. But the truth is, sadly, in too many cases, the Africans have shown resolve at the beginning, only to later let their spines turn to jello later on. So the chances are fair to middling that if the U.S. puts enough money on the table, the government in Niger might decide, well, maybe we'll bring them back later on, and we've proven our point. They got the message. We proved our point. So already the plan is that before the U.S. even packs one suitcase, preparations are already being made for them to come back. And Niger wants to maintain a working relationship with the U.S. Well, we know what that means. That means money. The government wants foreign aid. They may not like the arrogance from these white government officials from the U.S., but they do like getting that check. It's free money, not enough for the people of Niger to prosper on. The people were never meant to benefit from it, but the money is just enough for the leaders of these countries to put in their own bank accounts. As always, when the U.S. spreads around these little old checks, it's always just enough to make sure that the handful of leaders at the very top of these countries benefit. Not enough for the people to get anything at all, but just enough for the 2 or 3 guys at the very top to actually benefit from, which is the entire point. At the bottom of this racist little hit piece by Fox, they put, quote, the Associated Press contributed to this report. Contributed to, the AP wrote the report that Fox posted. They just copied and pasted what the AP wrote. Understand, this is what a lot, if not most of your white media that you read comes from. This is how they operate. You should actually take a moment to look at some of these articles that you read online and look and see how often that they mention that this stuff originally came from the AP. They'll usually have like one lonely little line at the top or at the bottom of it that says, yeah, we copied and pasted this from the AP. And this is what they're copying and pasting. Now back to the AP propaganda piece that Fox copied and pasted, they ended with this. The U.S. should find a new mode of engagement that departs from the failed counterterrorism cooperation model of the past decade and continues to press other states in the Sahel region on accountability and human rights abuses, said Hannah Ray Armstrong, a senior consultant on Sahel peace and security. Did you get that? This woman's sitting here saying that the U.S. needs to continue to press other states in the Sahel region on accountability and human rights abuses. So we see the plan for dominating Africa remains the same. At no point does anyone say that the U.S.'s lecturing and arrogance has to stop, and that the U.S.'s hypocrisy on human rights is the reason why the U.S. has no credibility in the eyes of these countries. No one says that the U.S. must focus on benefiting these African nations instead of just using and abusing them as nothing more than pawns in a global game of chess. And the person the AP quotes, this Hannah Ray Armstrong woman, she uses press the other states in the region. You need to press the other states in the Sahel region. I guess she figured that saying oppress would have been seen as a little bit too on the nose. They have to press these African countries on accountability. Accountability? Accountability to whom? Who does this white woman think that the Africans are accountable to? See, this person is letting slip what the white powers that be say behind closed doors. These Africans have to be pressed to do what we want. The U.S. needs to press them on their accountability to the U.S. They have to be reminded that they're accountable to white power. And the U.S. is the last country on earth to be talking about human rights violations, so this Hannah Ray Armstrong woman sounds doubly lunatic when she talks like that. And one more thing, I was curious who this woman is. Who is Hannah Ray Armstrong? I went on LinkedIn and this is what I found. So this is a white Jewish woman who's lecturing the Africans about accountability and human rights. How refreshing to have a white pundit lecturing black people about what she thinks they ought to do, which is exactly the kind of arrogant behavior that caused the Nigerians to kick the U.S. out in the first place. No cure for stupid. She's not African, she's not even black. She's a white woman who thinks it's her place to say what Africa should do. Notice I don't say she thinks it's her place to say what will benefit the Africans. She doesn't even make a pretense that she cares about what benefits them. She's just giving a straight, what is going to enhance the power and influence of the U.S. line. Okay, she can do that. She's a white woman from the U.S. She's not African, so I guess it makes sense that all she cares about is what's in white power's interest. But the Africans should also seek to do only what is in their interest and only what is for their benefit. She should agree with that, after all, what's good for the goose. I mean, she's got real nerve talking about human rights violations. She lives in the United States, one of the most oppressive regimes on the planet. The U.S. oppresses and abuses black Americans every day for centuries. This woman didn't have to go to Africa to find any human rights violations. She's got tons of them right at home. The U.S. is right now funding and arming a genocidal regime in Israel, and this woman has the gall to talk about the U.S. needing to press the Africans on accountability and human rights. Who is she kidding? This is who the Associated Press quotes from, because the AP is a mouthpiece for white power. They spout the line that white power wants out there. Their reporting is meant to be comforting to the beneficiaries of white privilege and to reinforce their twisted worldview. This is the old white man's burden that we're seeing. The burden of controlling black people. That's what she's saying in the 21st century. And when you look at the U.S.'s behavior, you see that this Hannah Ray Armstrong woman, her attitude accurately reflects the U.S. government's attitude. The Africans need to be pressed to do what white power wants. And they're just poor savages who are utterly dependent on U.S. aid, and they'll be sorry if the U.S. isn't there, and they're Russian pawns, and that's all the rest of it. Well, why aren't the Russians having to build bases over there? Why aren't the Russians having to bring in alleged millions of dollars in foreign aid in order to woo the Nigerians? Why is it that the Russians are being better received? An unnamed State Department official said that the Nigerians want all foreign forces out of the country. Well, obviously they don't want all of them out. Because in the very next sentence, the piece says that the Nigerians are bringing in the Russians to train their military forces. So they're telling everybody to get out, while at the same time telling the Russians, come right on in. So this is not so much about hostility toward foreign powers as it is removing the arrogant white colonial powers. Notice how that word never comes up in the AP's piece. Nothing about colonization, nothing about colonies. No, it's just, oh, well, they're telling the U.S. to leave and they'll be sorry and these guys are at the bottom of every list. Well, they're obviously not at the bottom of list of countries that people want to get into. The U.S. wants in, and the Russians want in, and France wants in. Black people telling powerful white people what to do, that's the problem. Because at no point does the AP or Hannah Armstrong or any other white commentator ever bother to ask if maybe the Nigerians are right, and the U.S. are the ones who need to be pressed on accountability and human rights. Nobody actually gives voice to what the Nigerians' problems with the U.S. are. Nobody ever says, well, what are the Nigerians so upset about? What is it that they're so angry about that they're kicking the U.S. out? They never ask about that. They don't. The entire point of this propaganda is to demonize and attack the Nigerians for their defiance. That's what the point is. By the way, remind me again how many military bases Niger has in the U.S.? I'll wait. If the AP was actually a news reporting agency and not a white supremacist mouthpiece, then what they would be doing is saying, this is a listing of what the Nigerians are saying that they don't like about the U.S.'s presence. Here's a listing of their grievances. They don't do that. They never tell you anything. And that's the entire point. This is about white racist bias confirmation, not about illuminating the landscape. This is not about mutual respect. It's about unilateral dominance. It's about white control. It's about white power barking out the orders. But this time, at least for now, it's backfired. And they're worried that this is going to become habit-forming for the region and ultimately the continent. They saw what happened when Robert Mugabe wasn't immediately smacked down. They saw that throughout southern Africa, there's now these growing bastions of individuals who decided that maybe it's time to shake their fist at white power. They didn't stop that one early, so now they're fighting an entire war trying to put out all of these brush fires down there. So the white media can keep putting out these face-saving propaganda pieces trying to portray the Africans as being foolish, or basically saying, don't worry, white reader of the AP, those niggers, they'll be sorry. They told white power to kick rocks, but they'll be sorry. But the U.S. is losing more than face. It's losing influence. Well, I for one hope that rather than this being a fluke, rather than the Africans deciding to backslide on this later on, hopefully Niger's actions may actually be just the first domino to fall. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Frederica Moore, Immigrant B1, Afro Elite, Alan Reese, and Connie Beasley. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.